All right, let's go ahead and get underway. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Joel Knudsen. I am a principal researcher at the American Institutes for Research and chair of the California Collaborative on District Reform. The California Collaborative is a learning community composed of district leaders, policymakers, support providers, researchers, civil rights advocates, and funders that has spent the last 17 years exploring district strategies to meet the needs of all students. The dialogue around equity-related issues has been especially rich over the past couple of years, and we're really thrilled that you're here and excited to hear from two superintendents who are leading some really important efforts to serve the students in their districts. Members of the education community have long been aware of the disparities in opportunity that separate students from certain communities and with certain backgrounds from their more advantaged peers. And I know many people on this webinar have dedicated their careers to addressing those disparities. However, attention to equity has come into even sharper focus in recent years. The pandemic laid bare many of the challenges that too many of our students face, challenges shaped by poverty, by race, by language background, by disability, by immigration status, and the murder of George Floyd 3 years ago this month sparked renewed attention to matters of racial justice. At the same time, we've seen the increased politicization of school boards and new efforts to reshape whose stories and whose lived experiences are part of our students' learning. In many parts of California and even across the nation, it's in vogue to say that we're for equity, but what does it actually look like for a school district to promote and advance equity to serve all students? We're really proud to release a brief that dives into that very question, and we're grateful to have two superintendents here to share insights and examples from their work. Jill Baker of Long Beach Unified School District and Matt Hill of Burbank Unified School District. Unfortunately, Nancy Auberon of San Jose Unified was planning to be here as well and got pulled away by a last-minute emergency in her district. So we will forge on without her. There are some great insights from her and her district in the brief that we hope that you can have a chance to look to. So we'll turn to Jill and to Matt in a moment. But first, I want to introduce my colleague, Linda Choi, who is the lead author of a new brief from the California Collaborative on District Reform called Making It Matter, a systems approach to advancing equity and excellence for students. And to help set the table for our superintendent panel, Linda's going to kick us off by highlighting some of the key takeaways from the brief.
Thanks, Joel. So during the 2021-22 school year, districts were resuming full-time instruction, beginning the task of pandemic recovery, and members of the California Collaborative convened 3 times to deepen their exploration of local strategies for meeting students' academic, social and emotional, and mental health needs. And of particular concern during these 3 meetings was the need to address systemic contributors to the persistent inequities in both educational opportunities and outcomes that the pandemic accentuated. So the brief summarizes key takeaways from the discussions from these 3 meetings about different ways that school systems can center equity in their work. And I think one of the most important things to recognize is that each of the districts that share their work in these meetings, they vary significantly in their context. And each district is at a different place in their equity journey, but 4 recurring themes did emerge from the discussions. And you can see them on the screen here. But first is that building an environment of educational excellence requires a system-wide commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, starting with leaders at the school board and extending all the way down to the classroom. That explicit commitment to equity by district leaders provides support and empowers teachers to advance equity efforts despite challenges and pushback. The second theme is that addressing whole child needs is crucial for student success and can involve a multi-tiered approach that integrates academic, social, emotional, and behavioral dimensions. Furthermore, creating safe spaces and elevating student voice are essential in supporting students' well-being and fostering equity within schools and districts. A third theme that emerged is that district efforts to center equity should be strongly connected to teaching and learning, recognizing that thoughtful and meaningful student learning experiences depend on interactions between teachers' knowledge, educational materials, and student engagement. So examining curricular materials and providing professional development focused on equity are crucial steps to bring equity to the classroom level. Additionally, hiring teachers who are equity-minded and reflect the student's background and experiences also contributes to advancing equity within the district. And a fourth theme that emerged is that advancing equity district-wide requires integrating programs and initiatives and aligning them with a broader commitment to equity. So those are the four themes that emerged. The QR code that you see on the screen links you to the brief that you can find on our website. And you can also see the link on the slide, or the web address on the slide as well. So I'm really excited for you to hear directly from the two district leaders that are here today. So I'm going to just pass it back over to Joel.
Great. Thank you, Linda. And like Linda said, we really encourage you to read the full brief. I think there's some really rich insights and examples, some of which you'll hear today. And we're really excited to have Jill and Matt talk about some of these themes and the way in which they play out in their own districts in the context where they operate. As we begin the conversation with Matt and Jill, we'd invite you to listen for a couple of things. I think one that Linda just mentioned, the importance and influence of local context on the actions that district leaders can and do take to address equity and inclusion, as well as the strategies and challenges inherent in doing this work at scale in an entire system. So the way we're going to approach this conversation, there are three general topics that we hope to explore. One is about the explicitness of equity policies and the communication around them. A second has to do with the balance of attending to whole child well-being and academic rigor. And then finally, we want to turn to matters of coherence and alignment in the work that school districts do. So starting with the explicitness of an equity policy and the communication that follows, given the political polarization throughout the country, and even that we're seeing increasingly in pockets of California, approaches to equity and even the use of the word itself has become a point of debate. And we see different approaches that districts take in response to this. Some educational leaders and systems have chosen to be very explicit about their work and really be deliberate in calling attention to the priorities that they're laying out for their school systems. Others, just district leaders and school systems, are choosing an approach where they're trying to fry under the radar, avoiding the risks associated with putting a target on the work that they're doing. And we understand that's a strategic choice that districts make when communicating about equity-related priorities that have their trade-offs. And we'd love to hear from Matt and Jill about the choice you've made in your own context. Matt, maybe we can start with you. I know one of the clear takeaways from our discussions in collaborative meetings is that district actions need to be responsive to and appropriate for their local contexts. Your school board adopted a policy on equity in 2018 and an anti-racist statement in 2020. Can you briefly describe what these policies entail and help us understand how the community history and context in Burbank has shaped the district's decision to move in this direction?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Joel. And thank you to you and the collaborative and Jill for this panel. This is a critical conversation that we all need to continue to have. Just context for Burbank, right outside of Los Angeles, we are 14,000 students. Free and reduced lunch population, about 36%. Predominantly white, but we have a large Armenian, Latinx population in our district. Our African-American population is about 2%. And so our approach as a district historically was one that focused on equity, but did not talk about equity. As you mentioned, Joel, each district has a trading point that they have to decide how are they going to focus on this work. So in Burbank, there's a lot of work focused on, let's make sure that we're using our data to inform best practices. Let's implement strategies to help our students that are struggling. And we did that for a while. I joined the district in 2015, and we did not put a spotlight on the history of Burbank, the inequities that are embedded in our system and our city, as well as just really it was a focus on let's keep doing good work for kids. 2020 was really the pivotal point for us. So when I got here in 2015, we continued that work. We continued to address the opportunity gaps that we had in our system. But in 2020, with the pandemic, with George Floyd, we were beginning the work really in 2018, 2019, taking a deeper look at our equity practices and starting to talk about it more. But it didn't amplify until 2020. And what we saw was our African-American population, 2% of our district said that you are not deliberately calling out what's happening to us. And we do not feel seen, we do not feel heard, we do not feel like this work is moving fast enough. And so we had an open committee that started about 2019 in the fall, and we made some good strides and good work. But in 2020, after George Floyd, we sat down and did an open call. So we had 2 school board members, senior leadership, myself, and we opened up to students, parents, community members, teachers, admin, anyone that wanted to participate in our equity work could do that. And we started with Zoom, where this is the middle of the pandemic. And we said, we need to stay focused on this now. And the 2 things we did, number one is we looked at our equity policy that we had previously, which was a California School Boards Association policy, CSBA. If you subscribe to their policies, it's a standard policy. That was our 2018 policy. What we did is say, we need to do something very specific to Burbank. What's happening in our community? What's happening to our students and our families and educators? And we sat down and created an anti-racist statement. And it was a bold move for our school board to adopt that. We allowed the community and the students to draft the policy with the 2 board members, and we brought it to the full board. So they adopted that. And then we went back and looked at that CSBA 2018 equity policy and said, this is generic. It's good. It focused on the right points that we've been doing, but it wasn't specific to Burbank. And we wanted to be more deliberate and explicit about the work we wanted to do. And we wanted to put a spotlight, especially here in Burbank, that we were a sundown town all the way up through the 80s. Where if you were not white, you were not welcomed in Burbank after hours. And so that was a historical racist past of Burbank. Redlining was predominant in Burbank in the past. And we never talked about it in Burbank. And so what we started to do is talk about our past and what can we learn from the past? What remnants of those policies and practices were still in our schools that we may not be aware of? What are those biases that we didn't talk about? So that really launched our key focus on equity. We've been doing the work prior, but we really put a spotlight on it, and we brought the community in, especially our students, to help us drive that work forward.
Great. Thanks, Matt. You mentioned 2020 being a pivotal time, and I'm curious about the way that played out in Long Beach too. I know, Jill, there's a long history of equity-related work in Long Beach. But in 2021, in December, your board adopted an equity and excellence policy that highlights the historical and ongoing disparities in opportunities and outcomes for specific groups within your district and commits to doing better for its students. Can you provide an overview of the context from which your work is emerging and the board's decision to move in this direction?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Joel. We are a district of 65,000 students now, 88% of whom are students of color, 12% of whom are Black African-American. And so I say that just to add on to the context that Matt set for who attends our district and that deep context that we hold when we think about the work in Long Beach Unified. 2020 was a time of transition in Long Beach Unified following Mr. Steinhauser's 18 years as superintendent. As he exited and retired, we were obviously in the midst of a pandemic. And frankly, what we were seeing were pandemics inside of pandemics in our city. And at that same time, in response to the murder of George Floyd, we hit a pivotal moment for us in the district. While many of the agencies around us, including the City of Long Beach and Long Beach City College, were passing reconciliation resolutions, I had the opportunity to come to our board and ask for them to provide for us the space to contemplate what we wanted in terms of long-term change and not just reacting in the moment. So, of course, we communicated with our community about what was happening, including the murder of George Floyd. And over several board meetings, our board commissioned us to bring together a predominantly community-driven group that became known as the Equity Leadership Team, along with staff, and to think about what a policy would look like into the future and what we were dreaming of for our students. The district had long focused on access and opportunity gaps and really had many strategies that it had used to change outcomes for students, and still the gap persisted, especially for our Black students. And so we spent from the fall of 2020 all the way into 2021, almost a complete year, going through a process of having community members apply to sit on a committee that would draft a policy along with staff. We had over 200 applicants from community members who cared that much to sit at the table and to help us think about our aspirations from a policy perspective. And what that led into were regular updates to the Board of Education so that they were always aware of the progress that was being made. It allowed for just tremendous lived experience of families who had children in the school district or had had children graduate from our school district, or were community members and what they were experiencing in the community, to bring their input. And so different than almost all of our policies in Long Beach Unified, which were based on CSBA models, the policy that came forward actually in its draft form in August of 2021 really represented a new way of thinking about a policy that had an acknowledgement, or it has an acknowledgement clause in it about harms that had been done, not just only in Long Beach Unified, in districts like ours, and really thinking about, even though we wanted different outcomes for our students over time, we had not reached a point of pride around, in particular, our Black students' achievement. And so the policy was brought to the board and then brought back to the board with some revisions and a little bit more community input, and ultimately passed in December of 2021 by our board. Not only is it a different kind of policy, including acknowledgement and new ways of thinking about the focus of the policy and who it was there to serve, it also laid out our first attempt to think about whole system change in 10 different areas across the district, moving from what might have been very strategic projects and different ways that we were working to address the opportunities and access and achievement gap to whole system change. And in those 10 areas became our first driving force around system-wide improvements that we are continuing to implement and to monitor. As we actually set forth at this time, we're now preparing to launch a strategic plan that those 10 areas will be embedded into. So from policy to immediate actions that the district has been taking, and then to launch into a strategic plan that is reflective of our students' data, as well as what we aspire to change on behalf of our students, most notably our Black students.
Thanks, Jill. And so both of you are describing a movement in your district to make a longstanding or at least emerging commitment to equity more explicit. And I'm curious about how that you're both a couple of years now into the implementation of those commitments from your board and your senior leadership. I'd love to hear how that's playing out for you. To what extent has that enabled you to mobilize a commitment towards that shared vision, towards serving all students? To what extent has that invited criticism or obstacles to the work that you're doing? How is that playing out in each of your contexts?
Yeah, I'd say there's a good bit of both. Change is hard for anybody. And so when you start talking about equity, there's a subset of the community that feels like they may lose something when you talk about equity. They want to stay how things have benefited them and their children. They also want to just focus on, let's keep things equal. If someone gets that, we should all get the same thing. And we've had a lot of deliberate conversations about the difference between equity, inequality, and social justice. And so we do get pushback from time to time, but I would say the explicit approach of our board, being unified with our students and our educators to make the right changes on behalf of all kids, not just some kids. But when we talk about all kids, we ground the conversation back in that. And when we talk about the equity that some students have not received the resources they need in the past. And some examples of how we've made some shifts, and it's what Jill was talking about, that balance between policy and practice happening simultaneously and codifying what we've been doing in practice into policy has been very important. So as a district, we've historically had open access to honors and AP classes, but it hasn't been in policy. And it hasn't been clear what that means. And so we started with a wide open call for this community dialogue. Anyone could participate, and we had a policy committee, we had an instructional committee, and then we had an engagement committee. So how do we strengthen those three buckets? And so through the instructional committee, we talked about how we have open access, but it's not in policy. So we had students and parents and educators working together, saying what should the policy be? How do we codify this? How do we bring this back to the board? And so that was an example. We put something concrete, and we had to make some compromises. In the past, we said you had to have A, B, or C to be able to access the higher level honors courses or AP courses. And that committee, the students really led it, said, well, let's allow it to be a D as well, as long as that student, that family commits to going to summer school to have the base level of content and knowledge to be successful that next fall. And so we'll do the extra work as students, but you have to give us access to that. And so that was a good, robust conversation that we're able to put into policy. And so that's where something we got resistance initially, saying we can't open access, no one's going to be successful. And then you can say, okay, how do we make sure the right supports are there for all students to thrive?
I'll bring just additional perspective. I could have shared some of the similarities or some of the same things that Matt shared in terms of both community members that feel absolutely empowered by seeing a policy like this, and some that are fearful of what their students or what their schools will lose. And so it has been an important communication effort for us to really highlight that an excellence and equity policy is about both. It is about excellence in every classroom and across our district. And it is about thinking about historically marginalized students or students that need different kinds of supports to achieve excellence. And we're very careful about ensuring that those two terms are talked about together in Long Beach. While we were in the process of thinking about a policy change, which our board was incredibly supportive of, it was also helping them to articulate the vision that they are holding for the community. And so there was parallel work going on, including our board working towards a student outcome focused governance model. And the beauty of an excellence and equity policy being held in the same space as a student outcome focused governance model is that governance model really brings forward a focus on student outcomes. And when you think about a policy, you're also identifying, in this policy, it also identifies who have been the least well-served or the least successful in their journey in Long Beach Unified School District. And so that outcome-focused governance brought forward the brutal facts of what was for students and really the gaps that existed before the pandemic, but were certainly tremendously exacerbated by what happened during the pandemic. And that's where we saw pandemics inside of pandemics in our city, where different parts of our city were very differently affected by what happened in the pandemic. So it gave the board a way to talk about implementation and what they wanted in a policy that would also drive towards this model of student outcomes, which is board members spending their time, rather than only talking about the business of the district, focusing the business of the district on both student experiences, but more importantly, student outcomes, and how we think about what we offer as a district in a way that reflects the brutal facts of our student data. I think what else was happening at that time is in the 10 different implementation areas that were being formed in the policy, there was active work. We were auditing our curriculum, looking at it from the lens of our BIPOC students and saying, if you are a student of color in our district, what do you see when you're in a classroom? How do you experience teaching and learning? So every classroom was being thought about and what that means. And we were really dramatically increasing student voice, and not just student voice in surveys and asking students to just participate among students, but bringing students into spaces where typically there are only adults, like on a curriculum advisory committee, thinking about what their voice would lend in terms of district, both policy and then also the implementation of the policy. This has led us into the last year spent with incredible support from David Montes de Oca, who works for CORE, in prioritizing, if we are going to attain the success that this policy drives towards, we have to really prioritize the work that we do. Think about where will we have the most dramatic impact on our students. And that touches, of course, in the areas of teaching and learning. It touches on to having a Black student achievement initiative that centers Black students in everything that we do, because we know that when we center our least served or most marginalized students, all students will benefit from that long term. And that is where I see excellence and equity truly coming together. And so the journey continues. There are a lot of, there are a lot of different ways that I could talk about policy implementation. And I will say, I guess I'll just land on that. Policy implementation will take many forms for many people. We're moving from this prioritization process that we spent a year doing, which leads us right into Vision 2035 and the strategies that will go into our Vision 2035 strategic plan. And I'm proud to say that it aspires to change the educational outcomes for our Black students and therefore for all other students as well.
Thanks, Jill. You've both touched on matters of instruction. Jill, you talked about curriculum. Matt, a moment ago, you talked about open access to more advanced courses. So I want to transition there next. First of all, I do want to acknowledge a question that came in the that was posed by a participant, which asks, are children with disabilities included in the discussions about equity and policy implementations? And Linda responded by quoting from, for example, the Long Beach policy, which says equity in LBUSD also means that we intentionally focus on BIPOC and students with disabilities as a way of centering our efforts. I don't know, Jill, whether you or Matt wanted to add a few words, either of you, about the way that students with disabilities factor into this broader commitment to equity.
Well, I think it's what Jill is highlighting with, you have to be data informed and first look at what the data is telling you about which students are not being served well. And it can vary classroom to classroom, school to school, or district wide. And then you prioritize the supports for those students. I think across the state, across the country, we do see that neurodiverse students with disabilities are not able to have they don't have the supports they need to achieve the outcomes that we expect. And so what should we do and prioritize that? And so that is a focus for us as well. And when we're talking about DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, we're also talking about language, we're talking LGBTQ+, we're talking about race. So sometimes when we're having the conversation here in Burbank, especially when we're talking about in 2020, we were really talking about our Black students, because when we looked at all the metrics, those are the students that were not being served well. And so we put an extra emphasis on that. That does not mean we're not looking at the data to support other students. And so it will shift from time to time. So we are having those conversations for students with disabilities. And right now we're also having a brand new conversation here in Burbank, because we're seeing a large influx of new immigrants to our community, especially Russian and Ukrainian. And so how are we supporting our newcomers in the Burbank community? And the data has shown that over the last year. So that's why it's constantly looking at that data. And I don't like to say data driven, because then you get narrow. It's data informed, because we want to hear those stories from those families and those students. So what supports do they need? So it does shift over time. So DEI is not just about one subgroup of students, but it is a deliberate prioritization about which students need the most support at that given point in time.
And our policy, as has been shared in the chat or by your team, Joel, does include students with disabilities, and there is an active area of work that is about reimagining programs for students with disabilities. And I'll also name that takes us to really think about the intersection of race and students with disabilities and what that means for students that are experiencing programming in Long Beach Unified. It takes us into areas of work around prevention and an overrepresentation of Black students in special education programs. And so it is named in the policy, and it is an active area of work in our prioritization, which will result in it being part of our strategic plan.
So turning then to the instructional core, I think one of the clear takeaways from the brief and from our conversations within the collaborative over the last couple of years is that if equity efforts are truly to make a difference for students, they have to be connected to the instructional core and students' experiences around content, around pedagogy, their interactions with teachers. I think one thing that the pandemic and research on the science of learning has also made clear is that students' well-being and social and emotional development is inextricably connected with their academic learning. And school closures, health conditions, race-related violence are all factors that have combined to exacerbate stresses and outcome disparities. So I'd love to ask about that balance between whole child well-being and rigorous academics. And I also want to call in a couple of the questions that were submitted prior to this webinar address that issue as well. I think one question asked about how districts align these kinds of efforts designed to address disparities with state standards. Another asked what districts can do to advance mental health while still promoting rigor. So I'd love to hear about that balance. And maybe Jill, starting with you, in our meeting in Long Beach last year, we heard about some of your strategies related both to instructional content and students' feelings of safety and inclusion. And I'd love to hear you talk about how you're balancing those things.
Yeah, thanks. So something that's been important to us over the last couple of years is really not separating. So you didn't, Joel, and I'll just name it that which we don't separate rigor and social emotional learning or wellness when we talk about it. And I think that's important to think about because it is a lot. It's a lot for a teacher to take on when they're trying to meet the social emotional needs of a student or their wellness needs, as well as maintain rigor in their classroom. And so we have tried to think about curriculum revision in a way that is supportive of what teachers are managing in their classrooms. And that curriculum revision has been informed by student participation and a curriculum audit. It's also we had not adopted a social emotional learning program or platform. And so some of that is our new adoptions and integrating social emotional learning into the core. And then I'll say outside of the classroom, which also comes into the classroom, are new areas of work around wellness for us. And that is, we are in the second year of installation of wellness centers in every one of our high schools. That brings in a social worker in most cases. And in a couple cases, there's a psychologist or a counselor who's then working with students in the area of total wellness. So whole child, as we say, thinking about prevention from a wellness perspective and also being responsive to their needs in a safe place on campus. The importance of the on campus is that as educators and especially as teachers want their students to be in class as much as possible. And so having a place that connects to the classroom learning and where a social worker or another mental health provider can, provide in sometimes time out, a quiet space, and also bring the student back into class, perhaps in a way that allows them to just get right back in there, has been really important to combining what we think of as everyday classroom learning that's rigorous and also is related to students' social emotional learning and offers a place for students to get different kinds of support that they need preventatively and also in response. What we saw happen in the first year of implementation of high school wellness centers is that the equivalent of every student visiting a wellness center 3 times took place. So we had over 60,000 visits to our wellness centers, which showed us that they would be well used and was the data that we used to expand into our middle schools. And we're seeing a similar effect there. Individual counseling sessions, small group counseling sessions in a way that is providing a support, again, to allow students to get back to class as whole people and to on their campus address something that may be bothering them, have another resource that gets them back to class. And so I think the attention that we have paid to students' overall wellness has had a tremendous impact on the way students are experiencing their school. How do I know that? One of the things that we implemented this year was a 3-time pulse survey. 10 questions asking students about what they were experiencing at school in 3 different areas around their identity, their sense of belonging, and their sense of agency. And I actually, to kind of test out my own skills and to really hear directly from students, met with students at every high school around their pulse survey data from their school and really dug into what the data should tell adults about their wellness and what they wanted adults at their school to know. And so we've tested out some new methodology and using the survey data to really drive towards what students see is most supportive of them in being in rigorous courses and wanting to graduate with lots of opportunities to go on in their education. But also, I think many of our students have shared that they reprioritize things in their life during the pandemic. And so having just a profile of many AP classes, or in some cases straight A's, has been reprioritized for many students. And so what we're really thinking about is how to help students feel equipped to do whatever they want and to feel well as have a good education. And those are a few of the ways that we've tried to do that over the last several years.
I'm picking up from both of what you have shared so far, the importance of hearing from students. And Matt, I know that one centerpiece of the work in Burbank has also been turning to students to better understand some of the threats to equity and some of the potential solutions. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that approach and ways in which it has shaped Burbank's approach to the instructional environment over the past few years.
Absolutely. And I would say that I want to echo what Jill highlighted, that the social emotional well-being of our students and the instructional needs of our students have to be tied together. And so when we engaged our students and we were prioritizing the work for this upcoming year, both of those things came to the forefront of where they wanted us to prioritize time and resources to help them. And so number one was just on the instructional side. They really highlighted that our curriculum, our instructional materials didn't represent most of our students in the school. They did not feel like the stories spoke to them. They did not feel like the authors were a mirror that they can look at. And so they were questioning what we were doing to diversify our instructional materials. So over the last couple of years, we spent a lot of time of having a hard look at what's mandatory for our students to read, who selects those books, what do we have available as optional reading for our students in the classroom as well as the library. So we've done a lot of work with our parents, with our students, with our educators and our teachers to pick a more robust, diverse set of curriculum for our students. And we're getting the feedback from students and saying, okay, whether I'm an English learner or I'm LGBTQ or I'm Black, I now can grab a book or engage in content in a class that represents who I am. And I can share my experiences and others can learn from those experiences. So we've done a lot of work on that area. At the same time, our students brought to us that about just feeling safe on campus, addressing hate speech. So two big areas that we've worked on with our students this past year. One is, what does progressive discipline and restorative practices look like with hate speech? We focused primarily on the middle school level and the high school level about what that looked like and how do we make sure that people are aware of the words they're using is hateful. It's not just teasing and joking around, it's actually causing harm to other students. And so how do we restore those behaviors with anyone involved? Which is sad, but I'm also proud of our students. That has gone down to the elementary school level. So at the end of this past year, I had a letter sent to me from elementary students talking about how on their campus, LGBTQ students were not respected and welcomed by some population of other students and parents. And so they invited me to a meeting. I sat down with them. I heard their concerns. They wanted to form an alliance club to support students. They wanted a stronger statement from me and the district at the start of the year to set expectations. But they weren't focused on the punitive. They were focused on setting clear expectations that all are welcome. You may have different religious views about LGBTQ issues. You may have personal views, but that doesn't mean you can take away somebody's comfort level or rights or feeling of inclusivity on a school site. I was blown away by the students telling me those stories, and they came with plans and action at the elementary level. And again, we were focusing on middle and high school level because we didn't think that was a concern that wasn't a concern we really were seeing. But by having these conversations publicly from the board level to the classroom level, we now have more and more students and educators, employees coming forward with their stories and saying, let's take action together. And so that's a shift about how we have to have those safe and inclusive environments. At the high school level, we heard from students last summer about how they didn't feel safe going to the bathroom. And so what can we do to do that? And we turned it back to them. Well, you know what you need. And they wanted badges. They just wanted to have a badge where they knew they could go to an adult if they ever needed help. Not saying they needed help, but they just need to know who they could go to. And they felt comfortable doing that. So by creating the space for students to engage with all levels of the district, we've been able to implement some quick solutions in a relatively low cost manner. A lot of the work we did prioritizing the budget the last couple of years was around professional development and giving stipends for teacher leaders on our sites. So everyone got the base level of professional development about bias, and then also having a base level of facing history in ourselves, training about racism in our education system and biases on that. And then this year we went deeper by giving additional training and support at the school level by enabling our principals and our DEI or teacher leaders with additional consultant support and resources to drive this work themselves.
I picked up, I mean, thank you for sharing that, Matt. That's all, I think, inspiring and fascinating. From what you shared and what I remember learning both from our experience in Burbank and Long Beach with respect to the curricular materials, being struck not only about the advantages of students being able to see their own experiences in the kinds of learning materials they have exposure to, but also fostering better understanding and empathy of other folks as well, and the learning value that has for the environment and the student experience as well. You mentioned budget just now, Matt, and any of the things we're describing, whether it be related to professional development, wellness centers, there are resource commitments in terms of time, in terms of energy, in terms of money that go along with the decisions you're making. And one of the questions that just came up from a participant is asking, how does all this talk relate to the changes in the budget and the processes to formulate the budget in Burbank and in Long Beach?
For us in Burbank, and I think it's similar for most of us in our districts, we've really leveraged the tool and the format of the Local Control Accountability Plan. The LCAP gives us the space to look at our goals and our strategies and align resources. By having this deliberate focus on DEI, we're bubbling up. These are some investments we can make. And it's difficult, especially now. We had the luxury, I don't know if I'd call COVID a luxury, but we had the luxury of additional federal and state resources to help get us through the pandemic and COVID. So we were very strategic with those one-time resources to accelerate our work, but we knew those were going to go away. And so a lot of the work we're doing here is building capacity of our existing employees. And so when I just mentioned the professional development we did, we want to make sure every single employee had a base level understanding. So that's why we brought in facing history in ourselves. And I know visiting with Long Beach on how they were able to build some of this capacity in-house with their resources. Given a smaller district, we needed that outside expertise to help us. And then we've been giving stipends to our teacher leaders, the DEI leads this year. We're going to do it next year. So they are identifying the goals in each of the school sites, and they're embedding that in their school plans. And then we're looking at more of a macro level at the district of like what additional supports can we provide through our LCAP process. So right now we're at a process where we're focused on doing one-time investments to build that capacity. We had plans to create more embedded functions with new roles like a DEI director level, embedding that with our secondary director and our elementary level. That's on hold right now because we've lost some funding through the May revise. So it's the combination of take the resources you have now and build capacity, and then keep planning for the future to see if we can make some deeper budgetary investments to support this work ongoing.
How about you, Jill? How is this playing out in terms of your approach to budgeting in Long Beach?
Yeah, similar story to what Matt described. I would say that when we started to see the influx of COVID relief funding, federal and state, we built a plan that we call our Learning Acceleration and Support Plan. And it was a way for us to really focus those dollars in a multi-year plan to the tune of about $140 million a year of things that we were funding. Many of them, like Matt described, were one-time investments in building capacity or building infrastructure. But part of what we did at the onset is we built in opportunities to evaluate new programs. And I can speak just to give a couple of examples, new literacy intervention and acceleration model that our research office then from the onset has been monitoring the impact of 2 different literacy programs that we're using, so that in our LCAP, when we make a decision, we're heading into our 3rd year of funding, we make a decision about what programs we will build into the LCAP and programs that we will take out of our LCAP, we can use our data to really show what has accelerated student achievement and maybe what hasn't had as great of an effect. We have multiple programs that we have conducted program evaluation on. And so actually the funds gave us just a great opportunity to try some new things that required funding in many cases, but also to really help us make good decisions in the out years when we are back into the traditional funding model of the LCAP and potentially facing cuts. And so we're seeing a positive possibilities from being able to study our own work and see the local impact of some of what we've implemented, including things like restorative justice programs. I mentioned literacy intervention. We have a couple of math interventions going on and using the opportunity to study them so that we can make an informed decision.
Great. I want to turn now to the third body of questions we had laid out, and that's really about coherence and building a coherent system. We've heard from leaders in the collaborative and from those around the country that in order for the various strategies you're pursuing to have a deep and lasting impact on the lived experiences, opportunities, outcomes for historically underserved students, requires that those strategies connect with one another in ways that produce sort of a focused, aligned, system-wide approach. We also know from research that coherence and focus are important facilitating conditions for improvement. So I'd love to hear each of you talk about the internal and external factors that can either facilitate or hinder your efforts to create coherence around the kinds of strategies that you're talking about and the way that it is integrated into the whole body of work in which the educators in your district engage. Matt, should we go to you first?
Sure. So I think we all know the answer, and for somehow in education, we never stay focused on the answer. And the answer is make sure you have everyone at the room at the same time. You're informed by data, and you have one simple plan that you can communicate and you can refine over and over and over again. What we're seeing now, again, is I don't know how many plans we have now, Jill, but I just got an email earlier today that we have to do our Prop 28 plan, and the dollar amount's changing. And it's not just the one district plan, it's every single school site has to have a plan. We have 5 different ESSER plans, we have ELOP plans, we have the LCAP. So what we know works is making sure that we should take the one driving document as the LCAP should be our overall strategic plan for the school district. So having that one plan that we're using the data, we have the engagement processes in place, everyone's involved, and then we align our resources to that. That's what works. So what we've been trying to do here in Burbank is leverage that system and then have these other plans fall into that. But be honest, we had a goal setting strategic review meeting with my board, and we were talking about we have 10 master plans over here, and we were in the same meeting, we were talking about our LCAP, and we're trying to get our head around how do we simplify this so that everybody can follow along, engage, participate in a way that's meaningful versus being spread thin. So I don't have the answer to me is clear. It's just we keep getting in the way through different entities, whether federal, state, or local level, that's distracting us from doing the work.
Jill, how's this approach play out for you?
I recently heard the term plandemic. That may resonate with you based on what you said, Matt, just plans and plans. And I do have concern about what is happening with the LCAP as well. And we know that there are not many people at the state level who know about why the LCAP came to be and the intent of LCFF funding, or they know it from afar. And so I hold a concern that local control is being disintegrated as more and more plans and budget strings are being attached to different things. So in our efforts to create coherence, something that, and I'll just go back to the policy really briefly, the 10 areas of our excellence and equity policy that we intended to be driving force behind change, those emerged and came at our cabinet as thinking about the leadership that it would take to lead in these 10 or 11 areas. And we have, over the last year and a half, gone through a prioritization process that literally took us from naming 84 different priorities among us, narrowing it down with the support of an executive coach to our team and David Montes de Oca, narrowing it down to 7 mission critical priorities. Those 7 mission critical priorities are based on our student data and where we think we can have most impact to address the student data, including culturally relevant leadership, reimagining programs for students with disabilities, how to address the needs of our English learners, our Black Student Achievement Initiative. And so from 84 came 7. And then it has been the work of our senior team to lead the way in thinking about the interdependency that we all hold around those mission critical priorities, because nothing in the kind of work that we're talking about, the complexity of this work, and none of it happens by a department. None of it happens by a person. It happens by all of us really owning the responsibility for our student outcomes and working together to ensure that whole system change happens with each supporting one another. And so these 7 mission critical priorities now live in work plans. They are common conversation at the senior team, or most people call it cabinet level, to enact the change that we want for our students. And they will, in the near future, they will also live in the strategies of the strategic plan and be grown through our Vision 2035. So keeping, I guess some people say keeping the main thing, something we've also come back to many times is to hold a teacher in the center of all that we're doing and think about all those priorities and what that means for the most important person for our students, which is the teachers they see in front of them and around them each and every day, because we know that classrooms are the number one factor and instruction, the number one factor as to what changes outcomes for students. Second is the principal and what happens building collective efficacy and collective responsibility at the school level. And so we've been very strategic and intentional about literally imagining the teacher and what it means to him or her when we're thinking about changes that impact classrooms. And similarly, what it means to principals when we start talking about all the things that we'd like to do, but we don't actually center those who will do the work. And so this is something that we're working on really deeply in the spirit of coherence and alignment, to have teachers, students, teachers, and the unit of change as the school centered in all of the plans that we're making. So narrower, deeper focus, which we believe is going to help us get to the aspirations that we have for our students.
Great. Thank you. We have one final question that's been posed by a participant, and I wonder if I can pose that to the two of you. When it comes to equity and access to opportunities post-high school, how do each of you address historical disparities for students engaged in pathways to college and career?
For us, it's our partnership with LA Valley Community College and Glendale Community College. We're making sure that we have access to dual enrollment classes. We've seen a lot of success with our students. We are working on a plan where we can give access or the opportunity to every student to earn up to 2 years of college credit before they leave. I know I've studied a lot of what Long Beach has been doing. They're a trailblazer on this. We're behind on that here in Burbank, but that is something we want to make sure that students have exposure and access and success to post-secondary. Also through us, starting in middle school, of just getting our students exposed to our different career pathways and sparking that interest and giving the flexibility to try different pathways so they can see, okay, where do I want to go, career or college? It's something we've been building out over time, and we've been seeing success to that. But a lot of that is just getting that entry and getting them on the right path towards college and career, and setting that expectation that we know which students historically have not had that access. So speaking with them to understand those barriers and removing those barriers for them.
Yeah, I would just add that we are in the exploratory phase of really thinking about how to bring more dual enrollment opportunities into our pathways. So our high schools are almost exclusively pathway driven with a course sequence that in many cases can be supplemented with a great dual enrollment class. And so in our partnership with Long Beach City College primarily, but some of the other local city colleges, really thinking about aligned courses that can be supplemental for dual enrollment purposes. We have a school that has an early college program where students will graduate with their AA degree, classes taken on campus, so supported. And then really thinking about the next generation of the college promise. So you're right, Matt, long history of college promise in Long Beach Unified School District, and some inequities that have existed that the three institutions are working diligently together in Cal State Long Beach and Long Beach City College to reimagine not just who gets in, there is that, but most importantly, also reimagining how to have the resources that students need once they're in so that they stay in and that they matriculate from the two-year college from Long Beach City College to Cal State Long Beach in the way that the promise aspires to have them do. And so there's much more to come for us. So it's always a journey. We're going from where we were, but really looking at the data about who has benefited from the college promise and taking another look at who needs to benefit from the college promise, including the supports that ensure that students don't just start, but they actually graduate.
Great. We're almost at time. I want to make sure I thank both you, Matt, and you, Jill, not only for your time and joining us here, but all the incredible work that you're leading and contributing to in Burbank and in Long Beach. Before we sign off, I wonder if I could turn to you one last time, and if you could offer one piece of advice to a colleague or to another person in a leadership position in K-12 education for doing this kind of work to address some of these historical and ongoing disparities and opportunities for students, including our most vulnerable students. What would that piece of advice be?
I can start. I think my experiences in the last few years, I have to say that finding a place for students at the table has been absolutely an important part, both of my experience, but what I'm seeing happen across our district. And so I would just encourage anyone to think about where students belong. And I will suggest that they belong in all the places where adults are making decisions, maybe not for the same amount of time and at all times, but our students really know what they need, and we just need to open up possibilities for them to express themselves and to be in the midst of the adults who are making decisions.
Okay. I think, Matt, that takes us to you for the last word.
Definitely want to echo that and then add on, any place you can find a way to grab and get authentic student voice is going to make this work, all of our work, just go much better. Second was the advice I got when we started this, was that, because I used to use the term creating a safe space to talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and the advisor that was working with us, that will never happen. This work is not safe. This is, you're creating a brave space. So knowing that you're going in to create a brave space, and you have to have the courage to jump into this because you are going to disrupt systemic issues, whether it's ethnicity, race, LGBTQ status, language, neurodiversity. People are going to be very uncomfortable. So know that going in, have the courage to continue. And echoing what Jill said again, if you bring the students with you, their voice will make your brave space much stronger. And so encouraging that over and over again.
Right. Well, those are wonderful words to close on. If people haven't had a chance to see the brief, you can find it there. We encourage you to read more about the strategies in Long Beach and Burbank and elsewhere in California. With that, we wish you all the best for those that are wrapping up the school year, for a successful close to the school year and a wonderful summer, and our best wishes for this deeply important work moving forward. Thanks, everyone.